Hello, podcast listeners. This is JJ Gordon. My aim is to meet every single person on the planet, and I'm going to introduce you to a great person, my dad, JD Gordon. A whole episode about reminiscing about my old man. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of JJ Meets World. And by the way, if you'd like to help support our podcast, visit jjmeetsworld.com where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some killer swag at our merch shop, or click the link to Apple Podcast and give us a 5-star review.
1, 2, 3, 4.
JJ Gordon, sort of like that Indiana Jones, in that he's always sniffing out his next adventure.
Yes, he is.
He's always interviewing guests so he can have them on his show and they can talk about pop culture, arts, and leisure. JJ has his flag unfurled and he likes his french fries curled, and he's fun and then he twirled as he goes to meet the world. He will march into the rain even if his ankle sprained. Take a peek inside his brain. This podcast is called JJ Meets World.
We're recording this on Father's Day, and so I thought we'd do a thing talking about dads a little bit. Because I recently had a situation where my dad was brought up in conversation, and even though he's been gone almost 20 years, it'll be 20 years next year.
Wow.
Yeah, since I lost my dad. I still get people who come up to me at events and places and be like, "Are you JD Gordon's son?" And I'll say, "Yeah." And they'll be like, "Oh, I think about your dad at least once a week," or "I've got a picture of your dad like in my man cave," or "Your dad and I went on this trip and I still go on this trip every year and I think about it." And I'm like, you know, what an amazing legacy to leave behind, where people are not saying like, I always go to the statue of your dad that they built, you know, to commemorate this, or I go to the banquet hall that's named after your dad, but they talk about experiences they've had. And my dad, I probably get the bulk of my humor from my dad.
Okay.
Because he was just a funny, likable guy. I don't think we probably would have been friends in high school if he and I were like going to school together.
Got it. Yeah.
Because we ran in different types of circles.
Yep.
But I thought I'd start with this story. So my dad was not like an attention seeker by any means, right? He was a guy people gravitated towards. I think a lot of people know that individual, right? Who walk into a room and they're not commanding it, but you know, a group follows that person.
Right.
When they get there.
Right. They're kind of a natural leader.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. My dad, like, I'll start with
You
this.
have that. I mean, you're definitely a natural leader, no question.
I think I follow along with that. I think that I'm someone
You have an
who,
orbit.
Yeah. I think I'm someone who desperately wants to be part of the group, but my dad, the group formed around him, if that makes sense, right? Like he's fine if he's on the outskirts by himself. But so my dad's born in 1951, lived in Grandin, North Dakota. His dad was the postmaster as well as a carpenter. And I think that my grandpa John, who I was only like just barely under 2 years old when he passed away from a heart attack at age 50, putting in storm doors. I think he was a guy who liked to have people talk about him. So he was the first person in Grandin to get a television, right? Like he liked people to talk about, and I think that I got that because I remember like when I got an iPod Touch.
4 channels.
Yeah, right?
4. If you don't like what you want, what you're watching, you got 3 other options.
And all you have to do is climb onto your roof and adjust this thing that they call an aerial. And he was also the first person on the block to get an automatic garage door opener.
When did your family leave Grandin?
So my grandmother, it was after my grandfather died, so probably 1986, 87, somewhere around there.
So right after we moved,
right,
because my family moved to Grandin in 84, 3. I was born in 85, and then we left in 89.
There's probably a small amount of crossover at one point.
Yeah. And I remember the post office.
Yeah.
Distinctly.
Right. Well, and there's nothing better than being a small town postmaster, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the office is open, you know, when it's closed, people come to previous guest Shelley Fink, her mother, Ione, was the postmaster down in Rutland. And one time she said, if you just put someone's first name on a letter and wrote Rutland underneath it, she goes, I could get it to who it needs to go to. So if you write Carl, Rutland, North Dakota, she's like, oh, Carl Lemke? Sure, here you go. And, you know, when my grandfather got his automatic garage door opener, there was a young boy next door who was developmentally disabled. And he loved following my grandfather around. They were good friends, right? So my grandfather showed him, you know, how to do little tiny things, and he helped with projects.
That's sweet.
And so my grandfather said that he had learned a magic trick, and he taught him this magic trick where he'd say abracadabra and point at the garage door, and it would go up. And then he'd, you know, go alakazam, and it would go down. And he's like, "Do you want me to teach you how to do the magic?" And he's like, "Yeah." And so he's like, "All right, you got to look at it, and you got to mean it when you do this." And so the little boy said it, and he pushed the, you know, button in his pocket and went up, and he goes, the way my grandmother used to tell it, she goes like, "This was a defining moment in this kid's life where he learned magic."
Mm-hmm.
Now, at one point, they had to pull back the curtain because they came back from church the next week, and he was sitting in the driveway trying to do it, and it wasn't working out. And so my grandfather used it as a teaching opportunity and showed him like, this is how it works, and this is a machine.
And actually, though, I mean, not to interrupt you, but that's also, you could show him then what a great joke to play on someone, right?
Right.
Teach him how to put this in your pocket, pretend like you're doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So my dad and my grandfather, I don't think ever really saw eye to eye together. I think that there was a lot of animosity, and certainly the only thing I ever heard from them about major disagreements is my grandfather refused to pay for any college for my dad. So he said, if you want to go to college, you're on your own. You're paying for it on your own, and there's no help from us whatsoever. And I think that made my dad angry. I think that my dad was like, why wouldn't you want to help me? I'm going to do something better for myself. And my dad barely ever talked about his dad to me. And maybe it was because he thought, well, you don't have a frame of reference. You were still pooping in your pants when Grandpa died. Mm-hmm. But my dad was a basketball superstar and also a track and field superstar when he was in high school. He was a pole vault jumper, and I think he ended up wrecking his shoulder his senior year. And so it took him out of being able to play like on a college level, which probably always bummed my dad out. But the only sports I really knew my dad to play would be golf. Loved great golfer. In fact, he said, the best thing about golf is your mother doesn't enjoy it. And so
so she doesn't want to come.
Right. Yep. So like I can go and spend 6 hours at the course by myself with my buddies. It doesn't matter. So my dad owned a company called Dakota Natural Foods. He had a partner and an investor, and they started it. And what they did is they processed sunflower seeds and peanuts for snacking. So if you think of like Giant sunflower seeds or Fisher or some of these other big companies, that's what they did locally in Fargo. So my dad went to an office that was above a food processing area as well as like a packaging area. And so I learned a lot about what business is like from my dad. Hell of a salesman. So he would like go and meet with the people who owned all the, convenience stores in a particular region. He'd be like, listen, this is our product. I stand by it. I think it's awesome. You should carry it. There are things that my dad, I think, got frustrated with in business. Like, why are people so stupid? So every year, without a doubt, every year, someone would try and sue Dakota Kid sunflower seeds because they ate a 1 pound bag in one sitting without shelling the seeds. They just ate the whole thing that was in there. And then they would block up their bowels. Yeah. And then they'd have to have surgery to have these. And here's the thing. When you have surgery that requires them to take out sunflower seeds, they are taking them out one at a time, right? From your gut. Oof. And so at one point, the back of the packaging had to include the phrasing, to eat, remove nut from shell, discard shell, eat nut. Mm-hmm. And that was it. And that used to bug the hell out of him. Also, we're so close to Canada here in Fargo, North Dakota, that you'd think, well, why do I want to like not have my product available in Canadian provinces? Tell you why. Because it means that you have to put everything on your packaging in French as well. And so it used to bug him to have to like
Was it
'Cause he
just
did-
too cost prohibitive for him? Or?
Well, at one point they're like, we've got to do it, but it meant a lot of extra work. So you'd have to shut down the machinery so you could load in the packaging that has the French on it as well, and like
got it.
the French the Canadian requirements. And so at one point they're like, listen, we're getting into France, but we're not making so much more money that it feels like
Canada?
it's justified. Or to Canada, but they could have gone to France too, I guess, if they really wanted. My dad and mom met because his fraternity brother Chuck married my aunt Ginny, and so my dad was on one side of the wedding and my mom was on the other side of the wedding. My mom and dad dated for a few years, and then they, got hitched, and I came around, and then my sister. One of my favorite stories that my mom told me from when they were dating, and this is a good indication of who my dad was personality-wise, was my dad owned this little house in North Fargo. So it was important to him to not to have something that he called his own, right?
Do you remember where in North Fargo it was?
So
I have a long time North Fargo resident. I'd love to know.
So there's an area of North Fargo that were all like World War II homes. So little tiny box homes. I want to say it was just off University, maybe around like 12th Avenue, or between 12th and 15th.
I know what you're talking about. Yep.
So he had this little tiny house, and it was a revolving group of his fraternity brothers who lived there. And so, this week it would be Hot Sauce, and the next week it would be Bearcat, and guys who needed a place to crash for a little bit because they were establishing their lives as well. Yeah, because they're all fraternity names, right?
Hey, Hot Sauce.
My dad's nickname was Gordo, which El Gordo means the fat one in Spanish, which is funny because my dad was rail thin.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was a thin dude. In fact, one time he's really he got really not offended, but like self-conscious when he was wearing a pair of shorts to a Billy's Corner bar in Vergas, Minnesota. And someone yells, JD, last time I saw legs like those, they had barbecue sauce on them, which I don't really get.
Chicken legs.
I mean, but is that what it is?
I think that's what they're saying.
Is that a bad thing to have chicken legs?
Chicken legs means you've got scrawny legs. So look at the legs of a chicken compared to the rest of their body. It's like little tiny toothpicks.
They got talons on.
Right.
I want to mess with chicken. But I remember, so, and he was just never a guy who...
pretzel sticks.
Right. Wanted to be like, hey, pipe cleaner. That would be offensive to me because it'd be like, I'm hairy and I'm a thin metal rod.
Yeah.
So my dad's rail thin, and my sister got his metabolism clearly, and I followed in my mom's footsteps of let's see how much weight we can gain in one sitting. So things I remember as from my dad, stories that I think are worthwhile. This is one of my all-time favorites. My grandfather paid for my entire extended family on my mom's side to go on a cruise right after Christmas over New Year's 2001 to 2002. So It was that New Year's. And there's a lot of us, right? So there's my mom, there's her three sisters, there's all of their kids. None of us were married yet. We're still youngish. So, but I got a ton of cousins. My Aunt Ginny's got 3 kids, and my Aunt Deb's got at that time. Okay, so Vika, Sveta, Aaron, Adrian. Oh my gosh, I think there's 6 kids that came with it. There's just a lot of kids, right? So I bunk up with my cousins Justin and Andrew, the Fosberg boys, who they were at the prime age of it's time for me to see if the fairer sex will notice me if I do things like strut or
look at that guy strut.
Yeah, they're like, look at that guy. So my cousin Gina, who's always been she's been a really interesting, fun person. I want to get her on the podcast at some point. But Gina was going around and trying to have a deep conversation with everyone, being like, what did you not fulfill in your life? What did you miss out on?
She was drunk.
She was.
Yep. I do that when I am drunk.
Do you?
My God. I just got drunk 2 days ago and I was doing that.
Do that?
Like crazy.
She was really what did you want to be? What did you want to be? And, people were answering. And then she gets to my dad at the end of the bar and he goes, Gina, I kind of wanted to be a cowboy. And she's like, "Oh, JD, why didn't you do that? That would have been so awesome. You should have been a cowboy." Like, and he's like, "Yeah, there's just something about being on the open range and, eating on a campfire. And I always wanted to be a cowboy." Now, everyone around knows that this is total and complete BS.
Okay.
Right? Like he's not winking at us, but we all see that he is just, because she's feeding into it big time, right?
Yeah.
So much so that at my dad's funeral, Gina was telling me, she's like, your dad never got to live his dream of being a cowboy. And so I told this story at his memorial service, and everyone laughs and they think it's funny. Gina's mortified and like practically runs out of the banquet room because she's just so embarrassed at like being played for this. And I'm like, but that's the thing, right? It was a harmless, fun joke. And, he gave you exactly what you wanted in that situation.
I bet for years she would have been gifting him like cowboy hats and stuff.
Right. Why did I get a figurine in the mail?
Is this a 6-shooter?
Certainly my dad's the best time of my dad's life, the time he looked back on the fondest, was when he attended UND and he was part of the Sigma Chi fraternity. He just had great friends, and it was an interesting group of guys who happened to be there at that time. I think that my dad took the idea of a fraternal organization to heart, that these are not just, that these aren't your friends you hang out with college. These are your brothers now. And he had an older sister, so for him to have like other male figures like that was a big deal. And he, like, his lifelong friendships continued afterwards. In fact, so much so that like the pallbearers at his funeral were all of his fraternity brothers. Jerry Haga, Hot Sauce, goes on to become an accountant and owns his company, and the company gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And yet every year, because it's JD's mom, he personally did my grandmother's taxes, even though he's to the point of where like he's not doing anyone's taxes anymore, right? He puts that to his underlings,
right?
And Hot Sauce, about a year after my dad died, he and I had lunch, and he said, like, I have a voicemail from your dad like 2 weeks from when he died, and I'll leave this on my machine as long as it will still, keep it there. And I'm like, that to me is just an awesome thing. Like, there's just not a lot of people out in the world that I think get that kind of attention afterwards.
Have that lasting impact.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
On individuals that they know. Yeah.
Yeah. And just the stories just go on and on and on and are so great. There was a time when they were going to throw this big party, right? This huge party. And my dad said, okay, listen, here's what we got to do. We've got to get plenty of beer, and we got to like invite all these people, and they can come over to the Sig House, and we're all going to have this huge bash. And he said, but let's not give Wes, my good buddy Wes Hansen, too much beer because he's been overdoing it lately, and I don't want him to get in trouble. So my dad puts this edict that they're going to like cut off Wes Hansen. Wes Hansen gets mad, and he goes, I'll go get a beer run. I'll get my own goddamn beer. And so it was a winter night, and Wes leaves, and he has this like head to toe raccoon coat, the type of thing that they wore in the 20s, like with boater hats and had pennants. And so the next morning, as like everything is just being cleaned up, someone's like, well, where's Wes? And they're like, I don't know. Did he ever come back last night? And so my dad goes out into the front. I don't know what he's expecting to see, but he goes, no, there's just lots of fresh snow, and that's it. And then you hear cough, cough, and then emerging almost naked from inside of a cocoon of his raccoon coat is Wes. He had made about 30 steps and then fallen over and passed out. There was a time where a former state senator was visiting their house, and a couple of those guys tried to poop on him from the second floor.
Oh my God.
Yeah, right? Like, I mean, there's
Jesus.
a lot of like crazy stuff that they did during the college years. And the stuff that I heard is probably these are the tamer stories that we can tell you.
More than likely.
My dad got called into his they had like an accounting class that you had to take. And of course, this is back in the day of like everything is done with, you get a workbook and you've got a pen and a pencil. And so he and like these 5 other guys get called into this accounting teacher's office, and the accounting teacher takes out a ruler, and he goes down and puts the ruler across all 5 of their workbooks, and they are all exactly the same.
Oh.
The same wrong answers, the same notch marks, everything like that. And he goes, clearly, you guys didn't actually do this work. It's clear that you just got one and copied it. So you're either going to retake this class or you are going to just have a fail. And so they retook it. There was a year where they had to take a gym credit and they didn't get up early enough to sign up for it. And so they all decide they're going to take dance, right? Because it'd be a great place to meet girls.
Mm-hmm.
They do the same thing where they sign up for the last dance. Ballroom dancing is the last one offered. And then they don't show up to the ballroom dancing class early enough. They're like 10 minutes late. And at that point, everyone's already partnered up.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad and his best friend, Jim Gunkelman, became ballroom dancing partners for an entire semester. And it was always a back and forth of like, who was going to have to leave? My dad put himself through college working at a dairy farm with his buddy, Jim Gunkelman. And, they lived on the top of this barn, and it was hot as can be. And they had to like share a bed for a little bit. And
Wow.
He and Gunk were just really good friends, who I think it didn't matter if they went time without speaking, like they could fall right back into whatever they were doing. And I noticed that on the last day of my dad's life, you can kind of tell when somebody is getting ready to shake that mortal coil.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of hospice people will tell you, you'll hear the death rattle, which is kind of this like liquidy lung type thing. People stop being responsive. And so my dad was diagnosed with tongue cancer in August of 2002. And by April of 2003, he'd gone. And that was after we went to Roger Maris, we went to Mayo, we went to the Bethesda Naval Clinic, and they did an experimental treatment. And they just finally said, there's nothing left we can do for you. And my dad, I've got one picture of like my sister going to like a winter formal. And I think that's the last photo of my dad. And, his skin all has this yellow tone and his eyes are kind of sunken in. And you can really tell that this disease has ravaged his body from inside out. So when the day my dad passes, people start making phone calls to each other. His buddy Gary had come over, and Gary and his wife had come to just visit my dad. And it was clear that he wasn't going to make it. So Gary started making some phone calls. And then no one had taken down our Christmas lights. It was April, and we weren't turning them on, but no one had taken them down. And so Gary's like, well, I'll take down your Christmas lights. Like, that's what I can do to help, which is such a Midwestern thing of I want to do something to help. This is something I can do right now to help.
Right.
And people started pouring in. They just, his fraternity brothers and business associates and people who just wanted to have one last, goodbye with my dad. And even though he wasn't conscious anymore, it was important for them to be able to say goodbye. And so we let this parade of people come through the house. Hindsight's 2020. We shouldn't have done that, right? Because my dad was a private guy and he probably didn't want that type of thing. He had stopped taking a lot of visitors at that point just because it took a lot of energy out. And I think it was tough for him to think of everyone gets a future but me. But so this tons of people, I mean, we're talking there's got to be 90 people who go through our house that day and want to just say their goodbyes to my dad. And it's been a long day. I remember specifically, it's a Sunday. My aunt Deb and cousin Sveta have just left, and my mom comes downstairs, and it's Chrissy and her now husband Brady, and my mom and I in the living room. We're just like, whew, what a long day.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about we should probably just order a pizza or something for dinner. And in the 5 minutes my dad was alone, he passed. Mm-hmm. And I truly believe that he was waiting for some peace and quiet so that he could go out on his own way, right? Right. That was his thing, is he needed a moment where it was oh God, for the love of God, come on.
Mm-hmm.
I get a kick out of thinking of a lot of stuff of my dad, and I'm very honored when people come up to me and say like, listen, I knew your dad, and these are some of the things that I liked about him. My dad was, when I had a basement bedroom, he never came downstairs. He stopped at the top of the stairs and he would just, be like, are you downstairs?
I don't want to walk in on what I think's going on.
And just a funny guy. When we were on that cruise, I was gambling on the cruise ship. And
how old were you?
I would just 18.
Okay.
So like international waters, you're allowed to gamble, right? But I won $2,000 on video poker.
Wow.
Right.
Damn.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So it's that thing where you win a hand and it's like, would you like to double by like, who picks the higher card? And so I won $2,000. And so my dad sits me down. He goes, all right, now big boy, listen, you've got some money. What are you going to do with it? And I said, well, actually, there's this excursion I wanted to go on where you get to wear a scuba helmet. And then they put you down the bottom of the ocean. And he goes, okay. Or you're going to college next year and you can put some money away from college. And my dad, opposite of my grandfather, my dad insists, he goes like, listen, I will find a way to pay for your college. Whatever you want to do, I'll find a way to pay for your higher learning. And, we've set money aside for it. We've made a plan. And so he wanted to do the exact opposite of what his dad did. Now, I don't think that he 100% understood when I was like, I love theater. Mm-hmm. But he did come to a couple improv shows that I did. And I think that he saw like how much I loved that and what that meant to me. And I know for sure he was very happy that I eventually found my people. Mm-hmm. Because for a long time, I didn't, I came home every single day after school and I watched TV by myself and ate Cheetos. And then I, would play N64 and go to bed. Right. It's a very lonely existence. And so I think they're pretty pumped for it. My dad never a really great technology acceptor. So I think he waited until the last possible moment to get a computer on his desk. When the Jetsons movie comes out on home video, he decides he's going to surprise my sister and I, and he goes over to Kmart and he buys it and brings it back and he hands it to me. And I remember this is 1992 when this comes out, and I would have been 9 years old. And it was the moment where he realized that his son knows more than he does about technology, because he hands me this thing and I'm like, oh, this is beta. Oh. And he's like, what? And I'm like, this won't play in our VCR. And he's like, yeah, it's a tape. And I was like, no, it's see where it says beta? It needs to say VHS. Right. And I think that was a turning point. But like, my dad loved, here's the real rub. So my dad was a P1 listener to KFGO, meaning that he had it on all the time. He listened to it on the way to the lake. He listened to it at his desk. He loved Tom and Larry in the morning and like when they'd have their joke of the day. He loved KFGO. And I can only imagine what it would be like for him knowing that his son ended up on the station that he loved so much, because I think that he would have been so incredibly proud. Oh, yeah. And
he would have been recording your shows if he had someone teach him how to record the shows.
Right.
Yeah.
Either that, or maybe he'd be like, oh, I'm going to switch over to WDUI.
Hey, he'll be on tomorrow.
Yeah, right. But that, I think that like in a weird way, that would probably be the thing my dad was proudest of, is that I ended up on this thing that he had so much respect for and so much revere for, because I think he was like, this is important. This is important to people, like people need their news. They need their weather. These are their friends. These are the people who, bring them the important information of the day. They bring some levity to situations. And so I'm very honored that my day job now is something that I think my dad would really enjoy. For about 7 years after my dad died, every time I took NyQuil, I had vivid dreams about him where he and I would talk about what's going on in my life now, and he would give me advice. And so, and it was weird because I didn't take NyQuil on a regular basis, right? I'm talking about like maybe once a year I would take it, especially because at that point I'm 19 years old. Right. How many 19-year-olds have NyQuil in like the medicine cabinet of their apartment.
I did.
Did you really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not something that I kept around. Like, I'd rather buy a DVD or go to Applebee's than
Falling
buy...
asleep has always been an issue for me.
Oh,
Because
really?
I have a very noisy circus brain. And so, like, sometimes I have to use NyQuil or something equivalent to it just to, if I'm like, yep, I can tell this isn't happening on my own this time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No bueno.
No bueno.
My dad, he was not, like, he's one of those guys who, like, when he got mad, he got quiet. And not that he was a loud person to begin with.
But you could tell, though.
Right.
It radiated a quiet,
Right.
a loud quietness.
Right. We had a lake place, but I don't think he ever really felt like a lake guy. I think he's a guy who would have preferred to have some acreage surrounded by farmland.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom was definitely a lake gal. So that was a thing. One of my favorite stories from my mom and dad is they loved each other. The marriage was very strained at the end. It probably should have been a divorce years before my dad died. But, you know, you stay together for financial reasons. You stay together for family. You stay together because your husband's dying, right? And it's like, well, there's no point in it.
Right.
So my dad, as I said, worked in this dairy farm, and then his office was above a functioning warehouse and factory. And at one point, my mom and dad are driving. Okay, so my dad is in the driver's seat, and my mom is in the passenger seat. And she's saying, I think tonight that, you know, we're not going to go out. We'll stay in and I'll make a casserole for dinner if that's all right with you. And my dad goes, did you just call me an asshole? And she was like, JD, that's it. You are going to make an appointment for the doctor. Your hearing is awful.
Right.
So they make an appointment. He gets into an audiologist and he says, yeah, it appears that at one point you must have burst your eardrum and it didn't heal properly.
Oh.
So what we're going to do is we can take a small piece of skin essentially from like your neck and then put it over the eardrum and you'll regain, excuse me, 95% of your hearing.
Damn.
You're down to like 30 and you'll get back up to 95. And they said, it's an outpatient surgery. It'll take 20 minutes to do this thing.
Wow.
And he goes, okay, yeah, right? So he says, oh, okay. So he gets the surgery done, and about a week later, I'm talking to him, and he does. He regains all of this hearing. So now, you know, you can tell like the world's kind of opened up to him again. So he's not sitting watching a Vikings game with it, you know, like be like, oh, Dad, take help, Papa.
Right.
So I asked him, I was like, Dad, how's it? And he goes, you know, I didn't realize how much your mother talked. And it was so true and so earnest. And so, you know, it's like, well, it's 6 or half a dozen of the other. But he was a fun guy. And, you know, he wasn't a Danny Tanner from Full House. He's not going to sit you down and give you life lessons on stuff. But he was a proud dad. He was a heck of a business owner. And I do really cherish when people come up to me and tell me stories. And this is an interesting fact about my dad, too. So when you try and think about how small the world is, I start dating Jill, who's now my wife. And a year into our relationship, I go out to lunch with her best friend from Hillsboro, Gina, and Gina's mom, Patty. My mother's name is also Patty. Not that that's important to the story. And I sit down and Patty puts her hands on her face and goes, are you JD Gordon's son? And I said, yeah, I am. She goes, oh, I had such eyes for your dad in high school. So she went to Hillsboro and he went to Grandin. And she goes, I was like 3 years younger than him, but I went to all of his basketball games and I had such a crush on your dad. And he, like, just his general presence had made such an impact. She named her firstborn son JD, but spelled Jaydee.
Oh my God.
Instead of just J period D period, which is what my dad had.
Did she say that to the father of her child?
Right. I would be like, well, what does Greg, your husband, think about this? But she goes, just one of those people that you remember your whole life. And I was like, well, that's amazing. And so I remember asking some of his like fraternity brothers who would have, gone back to Grandin with him back in the day, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we remember Patty Hansen, yeah, like, yeah, oh boy, she did. She had eyes for your dad, boy, oh boy, she thought he was just about the bee's knees." And
But he wasn't feeling her, apparently.
Nope. I think, my dad married my mom, who was 6 years his junior, but I think my dad dated a lot of women. And like one of the things in all the fraternity, at one point they hired a caricature artist to come in, and the 30 guys who were in the fraternity at the time all had a caricature done on butcher paper. So, and it was done with kind of, it must have been like a really light pastel kind of like grease, like a grease crayon.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all doing things like they've got a big head and a small body, but they're doing, like one of them is holding like a jug that's like XXX on it.
Right.
And another one is,
golf clubs or whatever they're into, their thing.
Not even that. It's all toxic masculinity
got it,
things, right? Like, so one of them is, like pulling up the skirt of a gal.
Oh,
I mean, like
Jesus.
you look at it and you're like, God, I can't imagine that even in the late 60s, early 70s, this was appropriate. And my dad's was just him leaning on a bar, looking straight out. The only one that you get the whole face. Everyone else is in like profile, but he's looking straight out. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, so even the character artist like knew that this guy was the one who wanted to connect with the people around him. And so, I mean, my sister has tons of stories about my dad. Clearly, people who come up to me have stories about my dad, and they're awesome. He had a couple fraternity brothers who were, what's the best way to put this? Who just never found their way, okay. Right? So when my dad died, we found out that there were like 25 life insurance policies for my dad, because that was a very low bar to get into business where people could make money real quick and not have to really work. So he bought an insurance policy from this fraternity brother, and the type of stuff where he probably put like $500 into this policy, but now it's worth 25 cents.
Got it.
Right. And none of them like furthered them at all. And so I thought that was like, that's a kind of a telling thing about my dad, is that he would do anything, like, hey, you're getting your start. Yep. You bet. Like, I'll buy a policy for everyone in my family from you, and would support everybody and everything he did. My dad also was a celebrity magnet for whatever reason. So he met and spent a night drinking with Shaquille O'Neal in New Orleans.
Really?
Yeah. Partying with Shaquille O'Neal at a House of Blues. That same night was the first time he had ever seen someone with pierced genitalia, because he walked out somewhere and someone's like, "Hey fella," and then pulled down his pants, and he goes, my dad said it was like a farm size ring, like, because he's from a farm, like a farm community. Like, he goes, in the tip of this guy's penis. And so
what was he doing in New Orleans?
Business.
Okay.
Something for business. That same night he met Dan Aykroyd.
Damn.
Yeah, right, because it was a House of Blues. My dad and his business partner D, we called him Big D, but he's like Danny DeVito size. So, it's,
yep.
It's
Little
like
John.
Little John.
Yep.
So
you could totally be cast as Little John in anything that you'd want to be.
Little John, right?
Yeah.
But don't let that confuse you. I'm actually very big. So
we don't pay no tolls. We don't eat no rolls.
I made that up. So my dad takes me, and Daryl takes his son Ben to a Twins game every year. And then eventually Daryl has a set of twin boys, and so they start coming along too. But it was this annual trip. Once a year, we'd go to a Twins game at the Metrodome and get to stay in a hotel overnight. We'd go swimming. We'd visit our friends, the Schumachers and Wes Hansen, while we're in the cities. And on one of these trips, now that these three other boys, who, I mean, I'm probably like 11 and they're 6 at best, maybe 5 and under. So there's a big difference between us. So I'm sopping wet from the pool, and I go and I find my dad in the hotel bar, and he is talking to some guy at the bar, and I'm like, hey, can we get money to order pizza? And he's like, hold on, I want you to meet this is Johnny Unitas. And I was like, hey, how's it going? Can I get that $20 for pizza? And so I had no idea I was in the presence of one of football's greatest like stars, right? And so my dad just spent the whole night. And I think the reason that celebrities liked my dad, my dad had like a personal relationship with Kirby Puckett for a while. And like these people, I think the reason they liked him is my dad wasn't the one who went up and like, hey, you're awesome on the Twins. My dad would be the guy who came up and be like, do you know if there's any mustard anywhere for these pretzels? Like he wasn't starstruck by any means. He was just a cool guy who, wanted to just shoot the shit with you from time to time. His business dealings led to, all sorts of kind of neat adventures and trips. But I also learned an important thing about business from my dad too, which was like, listen, it's not fun to be on the road. At one point, you really miss your family. You miss your own bed. You miss your dog. And even though my dad could have been on the road, 50 weeks out of the year, he really, by the time I was 10, would only go out of town if it was absolutely necessary.
And you're guessing like sales stuff? Is that what it was? Basically deal making?
So one of the times, though, he brought me, and it was the greatest trip of my entire life.
Whoa.
So because he was in like the snack food industry, there are snack food conventions.
Okay.
So the Comic-Cons of snacks. And so my dad, when I was 12, said, I'll take JJ to this. It's a weekend like trade show. And he can just come and do whatever he wants, right? And so it's Cleveland. So I go out there and I'm like, ugh, this is gonna suck. Why do I want to go to this stupid thing? So it's at a gigantic, like this thing went on forever. And I mean, little kid eyes, so think about that. But as far as the eye can see, and it was free samples from everyone who made any kind of a snack. So it was the year that M&M introduced the M&M minis. And so they like, here's a pound of them, take this. You walk by and it's Jack Links and they're like, here's 70 kinds of beef jerky. Do we want one of each? Do you want 10 of each? It doesn't matter. I just spent 2 days
just snacking.
Going
Did you ever have actual meals then, or was it just snacks the whole way?
I didn't need anything. My dad went out, was like, well, we're gonna go out tonight with these guys, for steak, and I'm like, I can't. I am going to poop my pants because all I've eaten are like triglycerides all weekend long, and so he's like, okay, and so I stayed in the hotel room, and I think I watched Rookie of the Year on the pay-per-view for it. So he's such a good guy. And when someone dies, we put him on a mantle, I think.
Yeah.
But right. I also, he had his faults, but his faults were also things that were kind of endearing about him, right? Like he and I never really connected as like creatives in any way, shape, or form. But I remember my dad asking me one time, he was like, well, we're going to make a commercial. What do you think we should put in the commercial? And asked my opinion. I was a little kid. Wasn't matter. Right.
Right.
The Dakota. So his company was Dakota Natural Foods. They made Dakota Kid sunflower seeds. And their logo for a long time was this old gunslinger. He had a blonde beard and he had a six shooter on his hip. And after Columbine, my dad chose to get rid of the gun in their logo, which I thought was really strong, because I don't think it would have mattered. It's an old cowboy, right?
Right.
Was it matter? But they just went, and so they just had the face. So they changed the logo for that. And at the time, I didn't understand why, why would you do, it's no big deal. Like, this isn't why kids chose to get a gun.
Right.
And now when I think back on it, I'm like, God,
it mattered to him.
It did. It really did. Because I was in 8th grade. I was in 9th grade. 9th grade.
2001?
No,
98. 98, 99.
Yeah, I was in 8th grade.
Yep.
Yeah, so it was spring of 98. Or was it 99?
One of the two, yeah.
Yeah, anyway. So, but I was right around the same age as a lot of those kids in that tragedy in Columbine. And I think that really put things in perspective for him. So they changed the logo. And at one point he decides we need to get one of those newfangled internet websites. And so
we need to get a Yahoo.
This is at a time when he has to plug in and to find out if a website's available, you go http://www, and then just you try it out, and if something's there. And so he wanted DakotaKid.com. So he pops Dakota Kid in there, and it's already a website, right? Someone's got it. It's probably like an Angel Fire, like easy build.
Someone pointed out to me recently that saying www takes longer than saying World Wide Web.
Oh, yeah.
So like also, the shortened version of it takes longer to say.
It drives me nuts when people say www. I'm like, yep. We're 20 years into this. Yep, exactly.
Jacklinks.com.
Really, all you got to do is tell me, like, is it something I don't expect? Because like if your company is Jacklinks, I'm going to assume it's jacklinks.com.
Or I'm not even going to just take a shot at the URL. I'm going to have a search engine tell me
what it is. Yeah. So my dad contacts the person who owns this website and writes him a letter and says, listen, I'd like to purchase this URL from you, URL. And
thanks.
We'd like to offer you $1,000 to purchase this from you, if that's fine. This guy sends back a novel. Like, it is just page after page about how I've been meaning to talk to you. You are bastardizing the true story of like an American West legend. The Dakota Kid was a real person, and you using him for your product is BS. And just this over and over and over and over and over and over again.
So no on the URL.
Right. So that's the thing.
2000.
So my dad has to send back a letter after this and being like, so that's a pass or and so I think they did DakotaKidSeeds.com, right?
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if they ever heard, and it, maybe eventually they were able to purchase it.
Back in 2006 when you and I made Milk Babies, I went and tried to buy milkbabies.com, but someone owned it, and I emailed them and they asked for $10,000.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were just camping on it, and I just didn't respond because I didn't have that. And I would never have spent that. Yeah,
right. Like. Yeah. Do they still let people do that? I mean, do people just sit there and buy and own?
Oh, yeah.
Wasn't there a thing like when Michael Bloomberg was running for mayor, he bought up like every, like Michael Bloomberg is a dick.com. Yeah, Michael Bloomberg sucks. Like bought all these web addresses.
At least back in the day, the registration of URLs was a good way to figure out what a company was planning on doing. So it was a good way to sort of get leaked information. So if you thought Sony was going to release a new video game of a certain franchise, you'd be able to find that they had registered a certain URL just to cover their bases, so that at least you knew it was a possibility they might develop that thing. But yeah.
God, it's just ridiculous when you hear some of that stuff, isn't it? Like
it makes me think of Conan O'Brien when he was on NBC Late Night, and I forget what it was, but he made a joke, www. It wasn't masturbatingbear.com, but it was like horny dolphin or something like that.com as a joke. And then he found out that that they actually have a policy that if someone is to say a URL on air that isn't owned yet, they're going to swoop in and buy it.
NBC
would. And so I got to figure out what the actual URL was. It was hilarious because it became a running joke where he was like, so I just found out that we are the owners of, and he gave this URL, and then they populated the URL and they would bring it back every single night in some way. I got to figure out what that was.
One of my all-time favorite SNL sketches is a fake commercial starring Chris Parnell. And it's a, it's like Hartford and Canstita Investments. They've been around for over 100 years, taking care of your 401k, your retirement plan, your children's college tuition. And they didn't want to jump in to the internet in case it's a fad. And it looks like a real ad, right? So it's him helping his kid learn to ride a bike. And he goes, and unfortunately, there was only one web address left. And so it's like, for sound financial advice, clownpenis.fart. For the next for leaving wealth and prosperity to the next generation, clownpenis.fart.
Me and many of my friends use that as just a pejorative for someone we don't like. Like, oh, this guy cut me off in traffic. He's being real clownpenis.fart.
And what's funny is at that point, it forced them to have to buy at least clownpenis.com, right? Like at least an NBC property. And okay, so after my dad died, you think, oh, well, you fill that void with like a father figure somewhere, right? Like even today, there are probably people who are father figures to me in some way, shape, or form. And it became your dad for a very long time.
And you know what? He's that for a lot of people.
I think so too.
You know,
I think his background as an educator, as someone who's in theater, your dad's superpower is being a dad. Being a dad. And
no question.
You know, I've trusted him to come and help me with moves before. The most dad-like thing that your dad and I ever did was when I was dropping you off in Minneapolis at the airport, I hit a wolf on the interstate. It had to have been a wolf. No, it was definitely a wolf.
A coyote.
It could have been a werewolf.
I think one thing we can agree to is that you hit it so hard it exploded.
Yeah.
And disintegrated.
Yeah, right. Like 100%.
So whether it was a wolf or a coyote, after that it was many wolves and many coyotes.
It was. I mean, we drove through a blizzard. With a girl named Natalie Meyer.
Yep.
And the drive was simply to drive you, and then we turned around and went home.
Yep.
So it was one of those type of trips. But so it's blizzarding. We get you to the airport, and I get back to Fargo, and the next day I look, and my bumper is on the front of my Mountaineer is plastic, and it's completely cracked up one half, and there must have been so much snow that it's now weighed down, and it's kind of like sagging.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't have any money to replace this thing, right? So I call an auto dealership because at that point I really don't know who I'm supposed to call. Remember, I don't have a dad at this point to tell me like, you never go to the dealership.
Right.
That's the worst place you can go.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, a new bumper will be like $1,800, another $500 to install it. And I'm like, what? What if I just buy the bumper from you and then I figure it out? And so I'm looking at it and I don't know what to do and I don't know what to do. And one day I'm kind of looking at it and I've decided, oh, I'm going to buy marine epoxy and I'm going to put it on this thing. I'm going to glue it essentially. And your dad comes out and he goes, what are you doing? Because we lived at his house at this time. You in the basement, me on the second floor.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I got to fix my bumper. I'm just going to glue it. And he's like, you can't just glue it. And I'm like, yeah, I can. I bought the glue. It's right here. It's right here. It's my car. And your dad explained to me, he goes, if you just glue it, the only connection point it's going to have is right there with the glue. And so your dad has these things where you drive your car up onto it. And so they're kind of ramps so you can get underneath. And so he goes, here, let's go. We'll go to the hardware store and I'll show you what to do. So we go to the hardware store and he tells me like, you need this different kind of epoxy because it's going to be plastic to plastic. And he goes, we're going to get this metal meshing and we're going to build the mesh on the back so that it's got all these other connection points and it'll be really strong. And I was like, oh, okay. I had no idea about that. And so your dad ends up helping me fix this bumper that day. And I still saw that car around until about like 7 years ago. And that bumper was still fixed.
Really?
Like
nice.
You can see where the crack was, but you can tell that like it's just fine.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and so we put the mesh and the mesh goes over both sides and, you know, like covers it. And we put plenty of this epoxy on and we let it dry. And then your dad, you know, grabbed it and kind of shook it back and forth a little bit to make sure it was going to keep. And it was one of those moments where like, yeah, you can find a father figure out there in the world. There are people who will fulfill that for you in some way, shape, or form. And, you know, we should probably come up with a better term other than father figure because there are plenty of people out there in the world who don't have a father.
Right.
But, you know, kind of it fulfills that role of a teacher in a way.
You know, I mean,
someone who doesn't judge you for aspects of your life.
I mean, I think part of it is it's one way to maybe describe father figure is a male in your life who is older than you, who has decided that they care about your future.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And therefore, they're going to do something to nurture you. And that can be someone else's dad. That can be an uncle or a big brother. That can be a teacher or a coach. And, you know, I mean, we say that it's gendered with like father figure, you know, mother figures do the same thing, right? It's really just an adult who has taken an interest in your, who cares about you and your future and is doing something to nurture you in that way. So like, you know, I have both my parents, luckily, and they're both incredible and I love them very much. And I also have a lot of father and mother figures in my life who don't replace my parents at all, but they're also adults who are older than me. Adults. I'm an adult. I'm 37 years old. But to me, I look at them as adults, right? Because we're different generations. Many of them are in theater B, and they care deeply about me and my life and my future. And it feels good.
Yeah.
It feels really
good,
doesn't
it?
Yeah.
And I think that when you end up on that, I've ended up on that for a couple people in my life where I've taken on that father figure type role, and it feels good. It feels good to give somebody a piece of your knowledge,
right?
To show them how to do something that they wouldn't normally do, to be able to be counted on. Like, so it's like, listen, I have to move and I got to move today. Is there someone, is there any way you can help me? And be like, absolutely. I'll be over there. And not only do you show up, but you call your buddy and you get grab their pickup truck and you have tow straps and you've got everything ready to go. So, I love my dad. My dad's a great guy. JD Gordon, awesome dude. Buried in Riverside Cemetery, now next to my mom. Just planted some mums this last week. So my dad was buried in the Dawson plot of Riverside Cemetery, which is my mom's side of the family. And so there's a giant marker that marks the Dawson family. And so on the front side of it where it says Dawson are like my grandparents and my great-grandparents, some family members who left us too soon. And then on the backside, for a long time, was just my dad, all by himself, which I think that he would have fucking dug for a long time, being like, that's right. Listen, I don't need the glitz of the front side. You give me the backside. I'll just hang up by myself. And so now my mom's there. And a ways back, my family put some money into like some landscaping around there. And we planted 2 evergreen trees and we put this mulch in and stuff like that. And they only did it so it's attractive from the front. And so the back is kind of cruddy. And so I said, this is a really good example of like how crappy families can be, right? Because they're like, oh, like they never think of anyone on the backside of that and like how that's got to look. Right. But again, my dad would have been the first person to think that was funny. He would have been the first person to be like, well, that's the Dawsons for you. He's like, So yeah, they're great. My dad never knew how to really like swing a hammer. He was never a handy guy by any means.
Even though he was kind of a man's man, right?
No, I would say this. I think my dad was a concrete kid when it came down to it. Like, he died at 51. My grandfather, as I said, died at 50. So I got to make it to at least 52. But he wasn't someone who knew how to use tools. Like we never had, he didn't go and fix our siding at any time or anything like that. He didn't know squat about cars. He was really good with like towing stuff. So like, putting the boat behind the vehicle and stuff like that. I never once saw my mom drive on a road trip. My dad was the consummate, so when I watched the episode of Pete and Pete with King of the Road, that's what I think of my dad. My dad was King of the Road.
King of Fraud.
Yeah. We took an epic family trip. It was 2 weeks where we drove across North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, a bunch of Yellowstone. So that took us into Idaho, Montana. It was way too much time to be in a van together as a family. And I think that it was probably one of my dad's most cherished times because there was nothing to do but sitting there and listen to talk radio. My parents would drive down to the lake and my sister would ride in my mom's van and listen to the Beatles and get an education in classic rock and roll and all this fun stuff and the flower power music of the 60s. My dad, as I mentioned, P1 KFGO listener. So I'm sitting there bored out of my mind being like, I got to listen to friggin' Egg Futures. Come on, man. And we used to, do you remember, did you ever get in a car and you turn down the treble and turn up the bass, right? Because you wanted to bump it. So we would go down to the lake and my lake place is an hour and 15 minutes from Fargo. And my parents would decide, because they wanted to retire down there, they would decide, we'll drive back on Monday morning. And most of the time it was my dad would drive back on Monday morning with us kids in time for us to get to school. And my mom would, close up the cabin and everything and drive back later. I hated that because it meant I had to get up super early in the morning and you're wearing essentially more like lake clothes and school clothes, and then you had to drive all the way home. And so one miserable drive home, I'm in the back and I'm trying to sleep, but my dad has turned the radio up so loud
because he can't hear it,
because the bass is turned all the way up and the treble's turned all the way down. And if you've ever tried to listen to talk radio in that fashion, it is miserable.
Yeah.
And
your head pounds because it's hitting your eardrums.
Right, yeah. And so to me, and I learned an important lesson that day, which is like, don't futz with Dad's radio. He's got it the way he wants it. And it's probably like 1998. What kind of music were we listening to? Some garbage,
Yeah,
Spice Girls? I don't know.
New metal, Korn, Limp Bizkit.
Probably was Limp Bizkit. Hey, Fred Durst.
What is he saying? Dookie? Nookie?
What's this thing? What's this thing about a Triscuit?
Are you watching Total Request live again?
So
that Carson Dilly Dally is a real looker, isn't he?
Yeah. Oh man, my dad loved a good sports movie. So like, Rudy was his jam.
Is that his favorite movie? His favorite sports movie?
I don't know if it was his favorite sports movie, but it was definitely up there. So like, my dad watched golf, he watched football, he watched baseball, and he would watch them by himself because none of us want to watch that crap, right?
Right.
I remember walking upstairs and my dad was watching the movie Little Giants, starring Rick Moranis and Ed O'Neill.
I love that movie.
Yeah, me too. And it really holds up, by the way.
Yeah.
And John Madden, rest his soul, has a nice little cameo in it. And I happened to be walking upstairs, and I can hear the play-by-play by Harry Shearer, of all people, going on. And they're like, and he goes like, and they've done a Giants win. And my dad jumped off the couch with, yes. He was so taken in by this Warner Brothers family film that he could not believe, like, he was just overjoyed. And so I'd like to think that and he's a full grown man watching like a children's, movie that's aimed at children, right? Like plenty of fart jokes in there. And I think to myself, whenever I watch like a movie made for kids, like I just watched Toy Story 2 the other day. I'm like, I can find joy in this. My dad found joy in it.
It was made by adults.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And like, there's plenty of stuff to like there. So this episode, long overdue, a dedication to J.D. Gordon, one of my favorite people on the planet, who is just so slyly funny and wonderful to be around, and to all the other father figures who filled that role in my life and the lives of the listeners and Tucker. Gosh, and also,
Happy
by
Father's
the way,
Day,
today, the Father's Day we're recording this, it's supposed to be 100 degrees out. And so
there's some grilling going to be going on today.
There's some grilling. I also saw a couple of dads mowing the lawn on the way here. And I thought, that's real dedication, right? Like 100 degrees and you're going to mow your lawn today. Wow. That's going to wrap it up for today's show. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help us continue to produce new episodes each week, visit jjmeetsworld.com, where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some swag at the merch shop, or follow our link to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all the sites the cool kids are using these days. JJ Meets World is produced every week by Tucker Lucas. You can find out more about Tucker's work by visiting moonbasemaria.com. If you want to get in touch with your host with the most, check out linebenders.com, where you can find direct contact info for JJ or booking information. My dad would never say bullshit. He would only say bull honky. And so for a long time, I said bull honky, like growing up, thinking like that was the worst thing you could say.